Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Ignite session, where we're going to delve into the topic of ADAS and autonomous feature verification and validation. By way of introduction, I'm Dwayne Crocker, Director, Industry Solutions, focusing on autonomous development. I'd like to introduce my distinguished colleague, Kurt Niebuhr.
Hi, Dwayne, and thanks for the introduction. Once again, my name is Kurt Niebuhr. I'm a PM in Azure Compute. Specifically, I lead the HPC AI workload incubation and ecosystem team. My team leans in and helps with a lot of the autonomous driving engagements globally, both with partners and customers. And I'm here to talk about some of that today.
Great, thanks, Kurt. Really appreciate it. Fundamental question a lot of people always have in their minds. What is Azure Engineering working on these days in the AD and ADAS space?
Well, as you can imagine, the number one important showstopper, absolute critical thing within autonomous driving is safety. In other words, how can you get people or goods from point A to point B, not just on time or on schedule, but safely? Because of this overriding requirement, from a compute perspective or from an Azure perspective, the number one thing where we contribute is validation, which is why now we invest a lot of time and effort in making sure the validation of the autonomy stack is done in a scalable and cost-performant way. And currently, there's two areas of validation that we're heavily invested in as far as just being world-class at this. First and foremost is how can you generate synthetic data sets or reuse data sets from previous driving campaigns into new campaigns so you don't have to go out there physically redrive all of those miles. This is especially critical for higher levels of autonomy, where you have the concepts of functional coverage, and there's just so much virtual driving that needs to happen. Doing it all physically is pretty much impossible. However, even though that is a focus, you will never replace the need to do validation of real-world data sets actually extracted from test fleets. So the ability to get data out of these test fleets and validate it at scale, in a highly, with high behavioral accuracy and great cost performance is a critical requirement, for our customers. So this is the other aspect that we're very much focused on. So like I said, in sum, validation is our key focus, either using synthetics or real world data, but most critically doing it, in a scalable and super cost performant way.
Great, thanks, Kurt. Amazing insight, and like I said, that question is always at top of mind for most in this space. One of the biggest problems that I think we're collectively seeing with automotive customers is really in trying to solve in managing the problem of solving large, sometimes disparate development tool chains for validation of autonomous functionality in an efficient and consistent manner. Sometimes across on-prem and cloud environments as well. How does our partnership with Kpit help address this underserved need in the marketplace?
I think the title kind of gives hints at that for this session, because if you notice, it's validation as a service for homologation on Azure's scalable and cost performant infrastructure. Okay, and the reason why that is we're the latter half. Okay, we are basically very good at scaling AI workflows. The CI/CD pipelines, ML pipelines, and validation pipelines. But we are not an automotive company. We can't tell you what a homologation testing procedure should look like. Kpit can. Kpit can then also deliver it as a managed service on top of our infrastructure. So that's why we're partnered with Kpit. And specifically with Kpit, the problem that we're trying to solve is very often with autonomous driving, and you have these test fleets globally, is, do you bring your compute to your data, or do you bring your data to your compute? Historically, most OEMs would try to bring their data to their compute. Like I was literally talking to a customer a few weeks ago that had test fleets in 9 locations globally, that they were spending over a month getting all the data, not just time, by the way, it's a lot of money, to get all of their data back to a single global location so they could run it on their, their compute clusters and also specialized testing equipment. Okay, I would argue that's a lot of waste of both time and money. However, in partnership with Kpit, we can actually run, a managed service globally on, one of our many regions spread, globally on specialized infrastructure, where we can accurately, test at scale these, validation jobs that are critical to ensuring the operational safety of these test vehicles. So that's really what the partnership with KPIT is about. It's bringing agility and scale combined with their know-how of testing procedures for homologation purposes to our customers, and basically helping making sure this world of autonomous vehicles is sooner rather than later.
Great. No, really appreciate it, Kurt. Incredible insight, and I really appreciate the perspective on how we look at our partner ecosystem to help us solve these significant industry problems. And I'm really looking forward, and I hope others are too, looking forward to hearing more from you and KPIT as part of the demonstration.
Sure thing. So I'd like to introduce three of my colleagues from KPIT today, Murali, Manaswini, and Badari. We are going to be talking to you about validation as a service, our partnership with KPIT, and specifically, sensor data reprocessing on our FPGA VMs. So with that, I'd like to throw it over to Manaswini. Manaswini, could you, please just quickly talk about KPIT and our partnership?
Thanks, Kurt. So in KPIT today, we are leveraging our experience working with a number of OEMs and tier ones in the areas of virtualization and homologation. So we have more than 10 years of experience in this whole ADAS and autonomous area, working on more than 56 production program with more than 20 ECU integration, 14 OEM partners, 8 tier 1 partners, and several patents and publications in this area. So what we offer is a 8-step methodology which assures validation as a service for homologation. We bring accelerators, which we will talk about few today, and provide engineering services to do the validation as a service, along with alliance partners like Microsoft. So what we assure at the end is assured coverage and readiness for homologation.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit more about, the 8-step of validation as a service and how we work together.
In the 8-step validation as a service methodology, the first 3 steps are creation of the synthetic scenarios. First one is creating the critical scenarios. The second one is creating further scenarios from the ODDs and regulations. And third one is creating from the safety and SARIF analysis. We also create in the 4th step a library of KPIs against which we do the validation. Then the 5th step is gathering the real world data and converting the real world data to synthetic scenarios. The real simulation is done at step 6. So we do the software in loop simulation for feature and function validation. And we do end-to-end platform validation through a ECU virtualization method and the safety validation for all of them. But on specially for the sensor validation, like the validation of camera, radar, and lidar, we do a process called reprocessing. And today, that is the focus what we have. And in step 7 and 8, it's about collection of reports and making them compliant to the homologation requirements. And at step 8, we do the real road testing.
Right. So step 6, as you said, is the focus of today's discussion. And it's also the major step where all the workloads, these workloads run on Azure. So, very briefly, when we run this on Azure, what, challenges are we trying to solve here?
Yeah, I'll just point out 3 major challenges today. The first and foremost is the logistical challenges, right? How do you extract petabytes of data from the global feed and more importantly, process them? That's the first one. The second challenge is the safety challenge, which is how do we really accurately assess the real world performance of the device, which is under test like the sensors as we're talking here for the purpose of the safety run of the job. And we should not ignore the third challenge, which is the budget challenge. How can I run this at most cheaper labor as possible?
Yeah, you have to spin up massive amounts of compute, so it gets pretty expensive pretty fast. So I do agree. You know, we're constantly working together on trying to run as cheaply as possible, and you know that's one of the reasons why we're also now targeting using not just CPUs and GPUs, but FPGAs as well. But today, like in a typical on-premise deployment, what does it typically look like? I mean, how do people do it now, like pre-cloud?
Yeah. So there are three major parts. The first part is the device under test. In this case, as we are talking, it could be camera, radar, LiDAR, or multiple of them. The second part is the replay component, which is the hardware component where the real data get replayed and processed. And the major part is the cloud or on-prem part where this petabytes of data gets processed, managed, extracted, and compared with the KPIs and scenarios that are stored.
So this basically comes back to the three challenges you were discussing earlier: the logistical challenge of getting all your data, back to the equipment. Then how do you then process all of that data, and then how do you do it, in as cheaply as possible? And that what makes it really difficult in this the on-premise deployment scenario today. So what's it look like on Azure? What's different?
So on Azure, what we did was we have gathered quite a lot of IP and assets while we are doing our reprocessing tests on sensors like camera, LiDAR, and radar. So we ended up taking that assets and moving them to Azure. And while doing that, we also wanted to take the biggest piece here was the device under test also on Azure. The advantage that we wanted to bring in here was, of course, to address the challenges. Can we actually use these assets, move it to Azure, and then kind of perform the open loop testing, which enables us to do, let's say, sensor accuracy, the KPIs, and even the most important bit is debugging of these functions. So what we did here as a POC with Microsoft and Xilinx was we took our .AD libraries, we kind of put it on the Azure blob storage, and we took the IP that we have on the scheduler, and we also have something called a load balancer, which ensures that it kind of feeds or orchestrates the data and runs the whole reprocessing on the device under test. And for device under test, we selected the FPGA, Alveo U250, and we built it on the NP series and moved it to cloud. So the whole idea was to move everything that we are doing today on the bench to actually Azure using Alveo. So how did the deployment look like? For the deployment with Azure and Alveo, what we did was we kind of took one of our LiDAR processing data pipeline that we already have, and we integrated like a three-step process. The first step process was to take the LiDAR functions that are of interest, profile it on the local PC, and then move it to the Vitis IDE, which allows us to move to the Alveo U250 infrastructure. And then finally, the most important bit is to move this device onto the Azure and then start profiling. So we selected some parameters like execution time on target, and this is something that we achieved. I would like to request Murli to show us the demo on how we actually did it on the actual system.
Yeah, thank you, Badri. So I'll be giving the demonstration of how we actually did it. So as Badri told, we have taken the LiDAR reprocessing, and we have identified a particular function which will be ported into the FPGA with having the Alveo U250 as the target. So before I just get into the video, the video is scheduled into 4 sections. The first section speaks a little bit about the current, the way in which we are reprocessing. The second section, from the second section onwards, it will go towards how do we actually perform the Vitis compiling the code on the on-premise solution. How do we do the profiling? On the third section, actually, it takes into the Azure, and we actually do the same thing, but we created the executables having the target as the actual hardware, which is Alveo U250. And the final section is we will be running the deployment. We already spawned the deployment machine on the Azure, and we will be running through a small example how it is being executed, and we'll show the output. So as you can see, the first video is like we have taken a simple example scenario called like vehicle crossing the section. Whenever any data which has been received through the sensors, we will be getting on the bench. So the data will be coming to us using point cloud data, and then the actual processing happens, and our algorithm in the lidar reprocessing creates this kind of output, which actually identifies the objects based on the input. And also we do some kind of validation just to gain the trust. And finally, from this section onwards, we will be going towards VaaS. So when we open a new application of VaaS instance, we have to create a new workspace. And for this example, we have taken lidar as the example. So we will be creating a new application project. So by default, it will be empty because it is pretty new. Then the first step we have to do is we have to import the sources. So once we import all the corresponding sources which are actually running, doing the computation of the lidar reprocessing. So this is how it looks. So basically this IDE has multiple sections. The first section is lidar kernels, and the second section is the actual project. Then there are two sections which are basically having the emulation of hardware and softwares. So for the lidar kernel, that is where we are currently interested on. The reason is whatever the code that has to go into the actual FPGA, this is where we have to implement them. So the extern C is the keyword which will be recognized by the VaaS SDK. And this particular function has broadly categorized into three subsections. The first is load, the second is compute, and the third is store. During the loading process, the actual values will be loaded into the buffers. And during the computation, the actual math of the logic will be computed. And during the store, the final output of the variable will be we'll be getting it back. So this is the function which will be going into the actual hardware function. And as I told before, extern C will be the keyword which tells the compiler this will be going into the hardware function. So how do we do it in VaaS? So if you go into the project, you can actually see the add hardware function button. So you just click it. So the list of corresponding functions will be coming there. So that is how whatever you see on the screen currently, it will be having the kernel points, whatever the logic that we have taken with respect to the lidar reprocessing. So the next step is once we have the code in place, the next step is we have to build the application. That is when this emulation of software and hardware comes into the picture. So emulation software, basically what it does is it just identifies there are no bugs. I mean, in terms of compiling, whether the dependent libraries are correct, whether all the headers are properly included. So basically kind of sanity testing. So we just run through, we just build the application just to make sure everything is built. So all the dependent libraries are intact, they are in place. Then comes whatever you see in the screen is we get a satisfaction that, okay, the build is successful. Then comes the emulation hardware, where this is basically done to create the profiling, which will be useful for making any adjustments. So currently we are building with emulation hardware. The build is successful. The third step within this sub task is we have to run the application with the binaries that was just created using building the emulation hardware. So once we run the application, we can see a particular test has been passed. This is just a sample test that we wrote for getting the confidence that, okay, this particular application has done what is intended to. And then this is how we see the profiling. So VaaS enables us to see the using a tool called VaaS Analyzer, where the corresponding CL bin file can be analyzed in terms of whatever the application, whatever the function that we have mentioned earlier, which was supposed to be going into the FPGA. We can see how many clock cycles basically, and basically estimate. So we can see the estimate of, as I told before, it contains three sections: load, capture, and store. So whatever the value that you see, this is exactly the kind of cycles that it will be requiring for executing those particular functions. And it also gives some other metrics. So for any optimization purpose, we can look into these values, and then we can go back to the code, and then we can re-update that. So for this example, we have taken the time complexity. Now the next step is we are going into the creation of deployment machine in Azure. So the reason behind this is basically we have the profile setup ready on the on-premise machine. Now we have to port this code into Azure, and whatever the output of the binaries that will be from the Azure development machine, it has to be deployed in the deployment machine. So here you can see there are two machines. One is the development and the deployment. So this, whatever you see now, it is the actual development machine, where we are now the target is hardware, not the emulation hardware, because the binaries that are to be generated now, it will be directly deployed onto the deployment machine. So basically the binaries, the executable and the XCL bin file. So these two are the basic binaries which are getting created by building this target as the hardware. And for this purpose, the target is Alveo U250, and which is what we have chosen on-premise as well as on Azure. So in this case, the compilation is successful, and then we are able to see the analyzer, just like we did the profiling on the local machine, on the on-premise machine. Now we can do the same analysis, but the target will be with the actual hardware, and this analysis is actually happening on Azure. So we see the kernel estimate, we see the clock cycles that are required for executing a particular function. In this case, the function is same, whatever we computed on the on-premise, as well as the one that we just recently built, having the target as Alveo U250. You can see the same load, compute, and store sub-functions on the actual function that we have taken. We can also see the corresponding result, how much clock cycles it has taken for executing those particular functions. So the last step is, now the binaries are created, we have to deploy it. So for doing the deployment, we have to do the attestation of the XCL bin. So this is exactly the attestation that is carried on, because to have the integrity and the trustworthiness of the XCL bins of whatever we have generated from our code. What we have currently is basically the deployment. We have the binaries ready, having the target as the actual hardware, which is Alveo U250. And here we'll be just running through a small example of how the processing is actually done. So for that, we have the input, which contains the collection of PCD files. And we also have the actual program, which is present inside the lidar_FPGA directory. So inside this, if you see, there are two files. One is the attested XCL bin file, and the second is the actual binary, which will be running just in a moment. So once we run this, we will be seeing the actual generated output. We can see the test has passed, and the actual output will be containing the all the bounding boxes, basically the object recognized. So the entire logic of identifying the object using lidar will be in place. So we'll be looking into the output directory. So previously there was only input. Now we have the processed output as well. Then if you see the contents of the output, we will be basically looking at a file which is containing the collection of bounding box points. So when we open the actual content of that, it looks like something like this, where we will be seeing the collection of points, having the bounding box minimum and maximum. So that is how we deploy a particular scenario, in this case lidar reprocessing with Azure and Alveo U250 as the target board. Thanks.
Awesome. This is incredible. Although I know we do this also on CPUs and GPUs, it's just really awesome to see it on an FPGA, because I really think it kind of calls out one of the benefits of our partnership. And and we talk about this a lot, but I really don't think it should be understated at all. It's first and foremost, it's about agility. It's the ability to basically run the job across the different silicon profiles in the most accurate way, okay, but also then at a great with great cost performance, it's just I'm really excited about to see it our partnership grow in this way, and I really would encourage everyone to reach out to either Microsoft or Kpit and ask how we can run validation as a service for you at scale. Manaswini, any closing comments from you?
Thanks, Kurt. As you already said it all, we together, Microsoft and KPIT is building a lot of such value-add solutions for homologation. Today we demonstrated one of it. There are more in the entire ZIL, the entire virtual ECU, and so on and so forth. So really looking forward to having more interactions with all the clients where we provide scale and efficient solutions.
Yep. Thanks so much for the partnership, Manaswini. Appreciate it.
Thank you.